Hello, participants. We will just be waiting for more participants to come in. Welcome, participants. We'll just wait for another minute. Okay, I think we can start right now. Can we hold on to the music? Thank you so much, EJ. Welcome, everybody. You are now in our webinar today. So, welcome. We are now expecting 304 participants from 44 countries. Our webinar is entitled International Trade in Crops with New Breeding Technologies, the Australian Perspective. This is the first webinar co-organized by the Murdoch University, Perth, Australia, the implementer of the Package Assisting Small Exporters, or PASE, and hosted by ISA Southeast Asia Center based in the Philippines. The International Service for the Acquisition of Agribiotech Applications is a not-for-profit charitable organization working towards enabling capacities of developing countries to harness the benefits of biotechnology. I am your host, Dr. Dora Romero Aldemira, Director of ISA Southeast Asia Center in the Philippines and the Global Knowledge Center of Crop Biotechnology. Well, I'm a trained scientist with a doctorate in biotechnology and plant physiology from Purdue University, USA, and postdoctoral fellowship from Albert Ludwigs University in Freiburg, Germany, on the molecular biology and biochemistry of golden rice, the beta carotene enriched rice. We gratefully acknowledge also the members of the ISA Biotech Information Network, Biotechnology Information Center networks. So we have there, when you see the logos in Malaysia, Chinese Society for Biotech, Indonesia Biotech Information Center, Nippon in Japan, Pakistan, Big Karachi, and the Lahore chapter, Vietnam Biotech Information Service, and the Circa Philippines, and in Thailand, the Biotechnology Alliance Association of Thailand. Okay, developments in regulation of gene-edited plants are changing rapidly. Increasingly more countries, including Australia, have implemented the deregulation of gene-edited crops. In Australia, this followed a series of reviews by the Office of the Gene Technology Regulator. Common approaches are also emerging among many countries. So during this webinar, our experts, our panelists will discuss the following: building international capacity for gene editing, science diplomacy, policy and regulatory aspects of crops developed through new breeding technologies, the regulatory landscape of gene-edited crops in Australia, and MVP policy approaches and implications for trade in Malaysia, Philippines, and Indonesia. This webinar will run for 1 hour and a half, and we are currently on live streaming at the ISA FB Facebook and YouTube channel. So all our microphones are on mute and questions should be entered in the Q&A function, okay? You can start putting in your question as soon as the first speaker finishes. So the chat function will be used by the panelists and for important messages to the participants. Thank you all for responding to our pre-webinar surveys. And at the end of the webinar, we will provide a link to a post-webinar survey and respondents will be given certificates. So I don't want to see any queries on, are we giving away certificates? So let's start the ball rolling. And our first speaker, I'd like to introduce him to you, is Professor Michael Jones. Is an internationally recognized leader in agricultural biotechnology. He is a professor of plant sciences and agricultural biotechnology of Murdoch University and the foundation director of the West Australian State Agricultural Biotechnology Centre. He has worked internationally with the departments of biochemistry, plant pathology, developmental biology, and plant breeding. He pioneered research on molecular markers for crop improvement and molecular biotech-based agricultural R&D in Western Australia and has supervised more than 50 PhD students and has 275 peer-reviewed publications. Current research focus are on applying new breeding technologies to crop improvement and on translation of research outcomes to commercial implementation. He has co-founded 2 companies and he had obtained his degree in natural sciences, major in biochemistry, and PhD in biochemistry from Cambridge University, UK. Let's welcome Dr. Jones, Professor Michael Jones. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. Well, I'll just share my screen. Right. Okay, can you see that?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Right. Okay, well, thank you very much, Olaf, for your very kind introduction. And first, on behalf of my colleagues, I would like to express my sincere thanks to the ISA team and to you and Maha in particular for enabling us to have this joint webinar. ISA has been doing a great job in this area for many years, but with more on a focus in the countries in Southeast Asia. And of course, Australia is intimately involved with the countries of Southeast Asia and more so as time progresses. And what we're hoping to do here from our part is to help move the debate forward and concentrate on developing a clear path to market for gene edited products. So we have a project funded by the Commonwealth Government on building capacity for small exporters to exploit new breeding technologies. And this is part of a package assisting small exporters program. So Australia, Well, it's a food exporting nation. It may export minerals as well, but it's a food exporting nation. And so this project then is a forward-looking project with the primary aim of enabling Australian grains and horticultural industries to be the first movers in applying new breeding technologies to crop improvement. And as part of that, we have to provide information on new science and technologies and on policies and regulations that relate to them both in Australia and with our trading partners. Excuse me. We have an additional aim, and that is to help promote international harmonisation of regulations and to reduce barriers to trade. So in this programme, we have a number of supporting partners, so the Commonwealth Government, Murdoch University, Department of Primary Industries in Western Australia. We have peak bodies like Australian Seed Federation and CropLife Australia, who you'll hear from. Exporters like CBH Group, bulk exporters, breeders, small companies, Grain Growers Association, and other small exporters. So why are we interested in this topic? Well, as you can see here on this slide, this is for Australian wheat exports between 2016 and 20. And you can see that out of the top 10 countries, 8 of those are in Southeast Asia, and these 10 countries are responsible for 70 to 80% of the imports from Australia. And that's just these 10 countries, that's worth $4.6 billion in trade. So it's a large amount. Similarly, if we look at barley over the same period, this was the situation up until 2020. Unfortunately, China has imposed an 80% tariff on Australian barley, so that this will change in future years, but actually what has been exported to China has mainly been taken up by other countries. And again, the majority of these countries are in Southeast Asia, but we also have Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait, and Qatar as well. And the value of this trade is $1.6 billion a year. Canola, slightly different form, but as you can see again, major exports, well, through the European Union, but then the rest to China, Japan, Pakistan, UAE, Nepal, and Malaysia. And it's interesting in this particular case because this includes GM canola. About 25% of the canola in Australia is GM, and about in Western Australia, it's a little bit higher, it's about 35%. We look at fruit and veg exports. Again, there's a lot of information on this slide, but the only thing you need to look at is the fact that 77% of all the fruit and vegetable exports from Australia go to Asia. So again, this is the region, we're in this region, and this is who we trade with. Well, Australia, though, is an ancient and weathered continent, and so that presents challenges to crop production. For grains and cereals, often it's water limited, soils often nutrient poor, suffer from drought and heat stress, and Australia is actually fortunate in not having many pests of the global pests and diseases, and so there's strong effort to prevent incursions of new pests and diseases. But what this means, if we are going to be competitive, is that we need to apply the best science and technology to improve yields and quality, and that includes gene editing. So if we look at conventional new breeding technologies, how they fit together, on the left you'll see a simplified conventional breeding program where you might have a beneficial gene in blue from a wild relative that's crossed with a cultivar, and then after F1 generation back crossed to produce a new cultivar. But what you'll see is that due to linkage drag, there are unwanted genes transferred as well, so it's not very precise. If you look at a transgenic or biotech approach, you can isolate the beneficial gene directly, usually transfer it using agrobacterium into the cultivar and obtain a new cultivar, and that the gene transfer is much more precise. And what you can see here, of course, is I've got three names: transgenesis, cisgenesis, and intragenesis. The methodology is exactly the same, but Transgenesis is from unrelated organisms, cisgenesis from related species or the same gene pool, intragenesis, gene or components of genes from the same species, and they may be looked on differently in different jurisdictions. And then in the last decade, gene editing has come on in leaps and bounds. And so that's just shown here as targeted mutagenesis, where, and I'm going to be focusing on SDN1, which we will talk more about, making specific targeted changes in a variety. Here's a scheme taken from a paper by Garrett from Cell, and this compares crossbreeding or conventional breeding, which actually is defined by the Australian Gene Technology Act as genetic manipulation, but then excluded from the regulations. Back crossings required, transgene free. Mutation breeding, random mutagenesis, many breaks across the genome, but again, it doesn't involve transgenes, takes quite a long time to market. Then transgenic breeding, introducing traits from other organisms, external DNA integrated, and that is then subject to GM regulations, which often extends the time to market. And then genome editing, or I prefer the term gene editing, targeted mutagenesis, back crossing is not required, and that speeds up the whole process of getting of the path to market. So looking at these gene editing technologies, ISA has already had some webinars actually on the technologies, so I'm not going to go into them in detail, but it started with zinc finger nucleases, then TALENs, and more recently CRISPR-Cas9 based systems. And these systems are all based on the production and repair of double-stranded breaks using either a process of non-homologous end joining or homology-directed repair. So looking at specifically at non-homologous end joining, the orange here is a Cas9, a double-stranded nuclease, and it is guided by the green guide RNA to make cuts at a precise point in both strands of the DNA. In repair mechanisms then, the organism, including plants, making errors at the repair site. There could be insertions, deletions, or mutations, and those can then generate loss of function or change of function of that sequence. If you add donor DNA with homology-dependent repair, then it's possible to add one or more or even a whole new gene in at that site. So non-homologous end joining is called SDN1. SDN2 is the addition of a few bases, and SDN3 is more bases, for example, up to a full gene. So this technology is advancing very rapidly. So there's sequence deletion and insertion or replacement, DNA-free editing, so you can combine the Cas9 and guide RNA to form ribonucleoproteins, base substitution, prime editing, gene segment deletion, gene expression changes, and epigenetic changes. I don't have time to talk about these, but this field is advancing very rapidly. Now, let's look at the power of the SDN1 gene editing for crop improvement. And what you can see here in two examples are for wheat, a gene editing of 6 MLO alleles in bred wheat to confer resistance to powdery mildew. And so actually the MLO gene is a gene for susceptibility to powdery mildew. And if all 6 copies of the MLO gene are mutated, so you can see on the right of the panel, the leaves, then you get resistance to powdery mildew. Similarly, work from Abe et al., triple recessive mutation alters seed dormancy in wheat. So if you treat heads equally with water, the ones on the left are the wild type, the ones on the right have been edited to prevent pre-harvest sprouting, which otherwise reduces grain quality and value. These technologies can be applied to horticultural crops as well. Here's an example from work in our lab by Dr. Sadia Iqbal. She's used both a transgenic and a non-transgenic approach to edit potato. And potato is actually more difficult because it's a tetraploid, heterozygous tetraploid, and it means that you can't cross it or you'll lose the variety. So, for example, in RNP based editing, you can combine the Cas9 and the RNP separately without any DNA present, shoot those into leaf cells with particle bombardment, regenerate shoots, and grow plants back. And you can see here in the work she was doing to edit starch branching enzymes, the aim was to increase the level of amylose, which is resistant starch. And you can see that the level has gone from 20% in the wild type to both in transgenic SDN1 and RNP up to about 43%. So this reduces glucose release into the bloodstream and hopefully helps reduce type 2 diabetes and improves bowel health as well. So if we look at the regulations in Australia, then living organisms are regulated by the Gene Technology Act and administered by the OGTR. And in 2019, SDN1 technology was deregulated in Australia. I'm going to focus only on that. But if you have food products, they're regulated by FSANZ, Food Standards New Zealand, Australia, New Zealand, and that is still under review, but and for public comment in the mid-year, but they will consider applications for commercial GE products at the moment. So if we look at the current status of regulation of GE crops, we're talking about now SDN1 crops, which are being deregulated in green. You'll see most of North and South America have deregulated SDN1 crops and sometimes SDN2, South Africa, Australia, Japan as well, for example. In the blue countries, there's ongoing discussion with recommendations to deregulate SDN1 crops. And in red, the gene-edited crops are still regulated as GM crops, and that's in particular the case in Europe and New Zealand. So let's have a look at Argentina, which is probably the most advanced here in their gene editing regulations. And they have 5 years experience of gene edited products. And that what they found is that there is much faster development from bench to market than for GMOs. So as you can see in the blue lines or the blue diamonds, that's GMO events. And in the red dots and the red line here relate to new breeding technology. In other words, SDN1, a gene edited technology. You can see the difference in the speed. And if you look at the developer profiles of what's happened as a result, you can see that GM products for 20 years, the ones that have been deregulated were from foreign, 90% were foreign multinationals, 8% local companies and 2% small SMEs, small companies. But for gene edited products, which have been deregulated for 5 years, there's an absolute game changer here. 59% local companies and public research, 32% SMEs, and only 9% foreign multinationals. So this really, GE technology, if deregulated, absolutely democratizes the technology. So many public institutions, public research organizations, small and SMEs can use that technology for more diversified traits and plant species. So looking at the path to market, well, if you had an RNP product with SDN1 with no introduced DNA, now that should be treated as a conventionally bred product. If you use an expression vector to get the editing, that will still be captured by a GM trigger, but in many crops you can self those, select null segregants which have been edited but have no introduced DNA, and again those should fall out of the regulatory system and be treated as conventionally bred crops. So looking to the future, FSANZ, we want FSANZ, the Food Authority, to accept SDN1 gene-edited food with no external DNA as non-GM. What we do not want is an additional tier of regulations for gene-edited crops and products. That's to say, same treatment for SDN1 crops and food as from conventional breeding. We need public acceptance of gene-edited crops and food. And in relation to that, I would like to see the term gene editing rather than genome editing, because our experience in the past is that any little word or change or subtlety can sometimes be picked up by those who oppose new breeding technologies of one sort or another. We also need to counter any EU influence on GE legislation, provide industry and government with updates and quality briefings, and help promote harmonization of international regulations for GE crops and produce. Now, my last couple of slides, I would like to quote from two recent ISA webinars. And the first one is a quote from Jose Jimmy Botello from University of Queensland. Paradoxically, the main challenge facing genome editing is not scientific, but political. It defies logic by introducing one single mutation in a specific genomic locus with extreme precision using Cas effectors is subject to strict regulations in some countries, while introducing thousands of simultaneous mutations in a completely uncontrolled manner by chemical or physical random mutagenesis methods is not regulated. And similarly, and a quote from a separate ISIS webinar by Professor Jim Whelan from La Trobe, feeding the world is not a scientific problem, it's a regulatory problem. So, of course, this is why we are interested in holding these discussions and understanding and helping to, hopefully helping to influence the policies and regulations in our neighbouring and trading countries and friends in Southeast Asia. So with that, I will end. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Jones. Now you know where Professor Jones places himself. He is an avid ISA webinar participant. So thank you so much for the comprehensive presentation of the science and opportunities of new breeding technologies in Australia. And I'd like to invite our participants to please put your questions in the Q&A function. It's very hard to look at them in the chat box, so please put them in the Q&A. Now let's move on to our next speaker. Mohammed Adil is a career diplomat with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Pakistan. He is also a PhD scholar at the Western Australia State Agricultural Biotechnology Centre in Australia, where his works look at the variation of regulation of biotechnology and genome editing in different countries, along with the role of science diplomacy. He was the manager of Pakistan Biotechnology Information Center at FC College Lahore. So he's a family actually, which was involved in science policy and communication linkages for biotechnology applications. He has spoken on forums such as TEDx on the social perspectives of biotechnology and initiated science diplomacy trainings in Australia for early career researchers, which was awarded as the best education initiative by the Council of Australian Postgraduate Association. He completed his bachelor's and MPhil in biotech from FC College Lahore, Pakistan. Let's welcome Mr. Adil Mohammed. Mohammed Adil.
Thank you, Ola. Can you see my slides?
Yes, can you put it on a
Yeah.
slideshow? Thank you.
Yeah.
It's okay
So
now.
first of all, thank you for that flattering introduction. And I would like to also echo what Mike said regarding ISA support. So having worked at one of the bigs in Pakistan, I can appreciate the efforts that ISA has been doing to not only educate people in the domain of agriculture biotechnology, but also giving them much needed support. So Mike's presentation provides me an ideal segue to talk about regulatory and policy-driven perspectives. So what we essentially see currently is that there are silos with regards to how science and policies are working. So during the course of my presentation, I'll talk about regulatory triggers and the landscape. What are the international negotiation interfaces? How can science diplomacy facilitate, and potentially pathways to market? So the need for talking about science policy, science diplomacy, and regulation, it stems from the fact that regulations, they are not based on scientific assessment, but also socio-economic and political considerations. Then there are different international interfaces. So how different countries through forums such as the United Nations and regional forums discuss and debate how to benefit and regulate emerging technologies such as biotechnology. So there is also this clash between different streams of international law, as I'll discuss subsequently, that different regimes they may potentially kind of confuse how to go forward in benefiting from biotechnology. Then there's also, as Mike expanded on, there's a false dichotomy of nomenclature as well. As we go forward with innovations and how interdisciplinary approaches and convergence of different technologies are enabling innovators, there's a need to, go away with, or, do away with false dichotomies. So is it a GMO or not a GMO? Is it gene editing or GM? That is basically, further complicating the policy processes. So the development of genome editing and its facilitation by converging technologies such as nanotech and artificial intelligence at some level as well, it indicates that just a, a, a nomenclature of exact GMOs is problematic. And then setting the regulatory bar too high, it basically enables the monopoly of certain corporations and reduces competition at the end of the day. So it leads to institutional drift. So there's also the need to further discuss what's happening at the larger level. So within Australia, how the process began was through a technical review of the gene technology regulations. So OGTR, which is the Office of Gene Technology Regulations, that is the lead organization that is leading the process. So the options that they basically provided in the survey, and that is the template of options that is provided, globally by different countries, is to, no amendments to the existing regulation. So you treat gene editing as, modification or the previous regulations. The second option is to regulate certain aspects of new technologies. For example, if it is SDN1 deregulated, or just some component of it. Option 3 is regulate some new technologies based on the process use. So that's where I'll talk more about regulatory triggers in the next slide. And then exclude certain new technologies from regulation on the basis of outcomes they produce. So that's basically a product driven trigger. So these are the basically options that are being provided globally during the legislative and policy making process. So what was the thematic outcomes of the OGTR review? What were the key themes? So this is a content analysis of the feedback that was received from more than 40 different organizations and the assessments that they basically produce. All of this is available on OGTR website. So what was the thinking and the mindset of industry, NGOs, as well as researchers? They said that gene editing is not GMO. So that is something that kind of pushed that consensus that the characteristics of the final product and not the process should be used as a criteria. There's also this ambition and thought that gene editing can deliver a new green revolution. Then thirdly, gene editing can democratize agricultural biotechnologies. Because if we do deregulate gene editing, then it can basically enable researchers to access those technologies and provide new innovations. Then gene editing should be regulated. So now we go towards the other side of the spectrum, the threat to organic industries and threat to trade because of deregulation, biosafety and biosecurity assessment, and there may be a harm to consumer choice. So this is the prevalent mindset, and it is also indicative of the consumer and the industry choice. So when we're looking at the policy continuum of regulation, these are basically the choices that different countries and even international organizations have when they're looking to regulate biotechnology. So on one side of the spectrum, we have a promotion approach where there's corporations and industries allowed to dominate the commercialization of biotechnology. And on the other side of the spectrum, we have a preventive approach where there's excessive restriction and there are trade barriers as well. So what we're seeing right now is somewhere in between permissive and precautionary. So within the permissive, there's a case-by-case screening for demonstrated risk. There's more element of science-based, regulations coming in. Then the adoption of different trade standards. While the precautionary principle, which the European Union has tried to champion, it focuses on if there's a potential for a technology to cause harm, there should be regulations. But who decides what the spectrum of the regulation is? So these are pertinent questions, and this is why it's not a black and white process. You have to look at the entire dimension. So coming to regulatory triggers, and so These are basically, there's a two classification regimes right now. The product-based classification, you look at the end product or the entire process used. So based on the country's legislation or regulatory requirement, you may end up with a product or a process based. But how gene editing is evolving and the diversity of choices it offers, you have to move beyond the GM binary. You cannot just look alone at a product and a process based classification regime. So, what are the legal foundations and regulatory mechanisms? An important correlation is that countries that have effective biosafety acts, that have biosafety legislations, are those countries which actually have some or effective level of regulatory mechanisms for biotechnology. So the initial prerequisite is that countries need to have effective gene technology act, biosafety laws, so that they're able to provide their researchers and the industry with a effective outline. So based on the legislation, it also kind of reflects the regulatory mechanism that they have. So we can look that there's a transatlantic divide. So not within the North America, it's a more product-based classification regime, while towards the European Union, there's a process-driven. Coming towards the international regulation, this is one aspect that is not discussed to a great extent in many discussions on agricultural biotechnology, is that there is a diversity of international regulations of biotechnology. So, such as from the disarmament perspective, you have to look at the Biological and Toxins Weapon Convention. From a health perspective, there's the International Health Regulations of 2005, the Cartagena Protocol, which a number of countries refer to while making their own regulations and legislations related to agriculture biotechnology. Then coming to trades, it's the World Trade Organization, which provides the sanitary and phytosanitary measure. And that's basically over here and over here, there's a transatlantic divide. So, and there's a potential for treaty conflicts. Then obviously social impact. So there's on a parallel, there is also a discussion on the ethics of human genome editing. So as you can see, this is an entire spectrum, and different actors are discussing this and debating this. So it's not a dichotomy between GM and non-GM or gene editing versus GM. It's a whole spectrum, and sometimes during the discussion, this goes amiss. So Latin America is a great example on how it is taking the lead in deregulation of gene-edited products. There's an objective of in order to promote agriculture biotechnology, we want harmonization. While large-scale universal harmonization is difficult, but Latin America has provided a great example as to how harmonization can potentially work. So as you can see, all of them, their legal basis, they are harmonized to a large extent, and there's regional cooperation between these countries. It's a lesson that many other countries can learn from. And by basically harmonizing their assessment regimes as well, they're promoting trade between those countries. So it's both science and the trade of agricultural biotechnology that is going ahead. Argentina, in fact, took the lead in deregulating SDN1 and providing a roadmap on how it wants to go forward. Another example for this would be a regulatory regime between the US and Japan. So over here, while US does a 3-tier regulatory regime based on how the product evolves, the Japanese regulation, they basically derive the definitions from the Cartagena Protocol. So at the end of the day, it is also dependent on how consumer perception, basically, if the consumer are looking forward to benefiting from biotech products. So based on this, what are the key issues? As I've said earlier, there's an institutional rift. So technology is evolving faster than regulations. Within the Cartagena Protocol, there is still the ongoing debate on how to go forward with gene editing. And it's going at a very slow pace. So there's institutional rift and new technologies are coming in. There's potential for treaty conflict because conflicting mandates of Cartagena Protocol versus the World Trade Organization. Crucially, there's this also battle of how do you define risk. There's this proposition that it should be just scientific based, but within the European Union, they also talk about the socioeconomic dimension. But how do you quantify the socioeconomic dimension? So this is where you need an interface where scientists, people from natural sciences, social sciences, and the policymakers, they can come together on a platform to discuss and debate these issues. Then obviously convergence. So if you bring in nano, quantum biology, bioinformatics, you are increasing the technological landscape. So how do you go forward with these regulations? So this provides me a segue towards science diplomacy is and does. So the basic pitch is that the problem we face, they're global in nature. Crucially, they all have a scientific dimension attached to it. They are cross-border and global in nature. No country or a single, discipline of scientists can solve them on their own. So science is a global enterprise. It's not a hegemony of a single state. They all have a scientific component, often obvious, and the science of the scientific method, it's a natural harmonizing language. Science as it's practiced across the world. So, what is the framework of science diplomacy? There are different typologies of how science diplomacy is perceived in practice. I will not go into too much detail on that, but I'll just briefly introduce the concept. So, it's science diplomacy is an interface where scientists can effectively communicate with policymakers, such as the diplomats, who go and negotiate these treaties at the international fora and create outcomes that are potentially enabling for both stakeholders. So, we have diplomacy advancing science. So diplomats are able to create structures, for example, the CERN, the physics research that is happening at CERN, and the Sesame synchrotron. Science informing diplomacy, scientists are able to inform diplomats on specific processes such as within the UN, then obviously discussions on climate change, and then science improving diplomacy, providing a new interface where diplomatic connections won't work. On the other side, how do you actualize science diplomacy at the strategic level? By creating policy documents which provide good and effective science advice to the policymaker. So if you are able to effectively science communicate, then your policymaker will understand the process. At the operational level, basically lobbying for more allocation of funding and policy instruments to support a certain form of technology. Then support at the basal level, at early career researchers, mid career researchers. This webinar in itself is an example of support. So training, networking, and capacity building. So you are able to cross talk more and more. So at the end of the day, you will have a community that will have a capacity to adopt leadership in new and emerging technologies. So how do we apply that interface for regulations of new breeding technologies? So Mike earlier talked about our project assisting small exporters. So that basically looks at three different levels. First, at the level of capacity building, providing scientists and diplomat platforms to basically cross-talk, learn from one another, and understand the nuances, and not just create binaries and create the dichotomy going. Second level, developing the same regulatory language as we have within this webinar, people from different countries talking about their regulatory regimes that provides, a pathway towards developing some level of harmonization. Then how do you render sciences wise to create coordination between treaty regimes? So all of these treaties, they have expert working groups. So how you can render science advice between the treaty regimes? So moving on, there's also a geopolitical lens that goes amiss in discussions. So countries will basically choose from different matrices, as we can see during the ongoing pandemic as well, vaccine nationalism versus vaccine diplomacy. So these are the considerations that states have. So while we do want the technology to move forward, we also have to look at, whether it's nationalism that will prevail or multilateral cooperation. So as scientists, we push for equitable distribution of technologies. We want more international cooperation, but we have to consider the entire matrix when a policy design is being created. So it's a battle between bioeconomy versus biopolitics. So the United Nations hosts different summits where discussion can evolve. One new platform that is coming is the Food System Summit. So one of the pre-summit, it's going to happen from 26th to 28th of July in Rome. There's a potential for discussions on, how new breeding technology can be adopted. So with this, I thank you for your time. I'm looking forward to for your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very interesting points, Dr. Muhammad Adil. I'm very glad that you have highlighted the process versus the product in regulation, and that we see that Latin America is leading the pack in terms of regulation of gene editing, and some information on science diplomacy that we need to discuss further. And I hope there are more questions on this as we go along the Q&A. Thank you so much once again, Adil. Now let's move forward to our next speaker, who would discuss gene editing in Australia, the state of play. And this is our guest, Miss Lucy Dara, is the manager of crop biotechnology policy and supports the director of crop biotechnology policy of CropLife Australia in the development and advocacy of best practice policy and regulation for agricultural biotechnology policy research and advocacy. Prior to joining CropLife, Lucy worked with grain growers where she represented grower interests and managed a diverse policy portfolio, including AgVet chemicals, biosecurity, trade standards, and grain classification. She has also worked with the Australian Farm Institute, where her work has been published across several editions of the Farm Policy Journal. Lucy holds a Bachelor of Agriculture from Charles Sturt University and a Master of Environmental Science, Plant Physiology and Genetics from the University of New England. Let's welcome Lucy Dara.
Thank you very much. And to everyone, wherever you're joining us from today, hello, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. I'd just like to begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm speaking with you from today and pay my respects to their elders, both past, present, and those emerging. So CropLife Australia is the peak national representative organisation for the plant science sector in Australia. Our membership consists of both patent holding and generic Australian and international small and large companies. And through leadership and advocacy, our aim is to achieve a strategic regulatory environment that provides the plant science sector the freedom to operate and ensure that the nation's farmers have access to safe, innovative and modern tools to support productivity and environmental sustainability. Today, I'll just provide you a brief overview of the regulatory landscape for gene technology in Australia and touch on some important consultations being conducted by our national regulators. Some of these were already touched on by Mike and Adil, and I'll just go into a bit more of detail around some recent consultations that have some pretty big implications for gene technology regulations going forward in Australia. So this slide just shows a quite condensed timeline on national gene technology regulation developments here in Australia. We have 4 key regulators of gene technology here, including the Gene Technology Regulator and her Office of the Gene Technology Regulator, the Department of Health, Food Standards Australia, New Zealand, and the Australian Pesticides and Veterinary Medicines Authority. Gene-edited plants are regulated by these regulators under what we broadly describe as the National Gene Technology Scheme. At the moment, there are a number of substantial regulatory barriers that impede research, development and commercialisation of products from the plant science sector here in Australia, and these include pre-market regulation of products developed using new breeding techniques, disproportionate regulation of gene editing approaches, and broadly a lack of clarity and clear path to market for products from our sectors. There are, however, a number of consultations currently underway or that have recently closed that are aiming to address these issues, and the outcomes of which we hope will promote the growth of new industries across agriculture, medicine and the environment, as well as contribute to leading global regulatory standards and potentially even the export of critical innovations, while also building stakeholder confidence across the supply chain. 3 of these core consultations are being conducted by both the Department of Health and FSANZ separately in some respects. One of these includes the Regulatory Impact Statement on Modernising and Future-Proofing the National Gene Technology Scheme, which closed in March this year. There's also, by the Department of Health, the Food Standards Australia New Zealand Act Review, which closed last month. And later this year, we're expecting the launching of a consultation for foods derived using new breeding techniques, which has been delayed since its announcement in 2018. Regarding the National Gene Technology Scheme, consultation and implementation of these recommendations has been ongoing and subject to extensive delays. The 3rd and most recent review of the scheme was conducted and concluded in May 2018, with key recommendations still yet to be implemented. More recently, a regulatory impact statement was released in late 2020. However, the proposed options as we see it would lead to the new system being obsolete before it's even implemented, and is far from what Australia requires to ensure it has a world best practice regulatory system. While there have been a number of reviews in the recent past, updates have been quite minor. We have had some progress with the deregulation of SDN1 techniques coming into effect in 2019, of which those were touched on briefly by Mike and Adil. However, there is still some asynchrony in our regulatory system that needs to be addressed before this technology can be truly appreciated. As I mentioned, some of the options proposed by the Department of Health in the recent consultation impact statement don't go far enough to address industry needs in terms of proportionate and clear regulation. And it is quite concerning that gene editing and other new plant breeding techniques haven't been directly addressed and are still considered new despite being under discussion for over a decade now. One of the primary issues facing our system is the disproportionate regulatory burden on certain plant breeding approaches involving gene editing, where the changes in the resulting organism are comparable to that achievable using conventional breeding, but the organism is regulated to the same extent as GMOs. This reinforces two major priorities for the implementation of recommendations, which we believe should be introduced changes to provide mechanisms that enable regulatory certainty and clarity for new and emerging technologies that aren't currently addressed by the scheme, as well as improve a regulatory approach in terms of risk and science-based proportionality and regulation for these technologies and organisms that are currently within scope of the regulation.
Excuse me, Lucy, are you moving your slides?
Yep, I'm fine with that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
And so just as it exists at the moment, the regulatory system can't keep pace and needs some more flexibility to respond to these advances to ensure that Australia can really reap the benefits of these innovations. Adil mentioned from the recent consultation what was proposed, a few options proposed by the Department of Health. And what we would like to see is an enhanced option B. And to achieve this, we think is the most appropriate way forward, making best use of the implementation process to address these issues and the regulation of new breeding techniques while being practical, feasible and consistent with the core principles of the scheme. So ideally, this would include items such as the recognition of assessments and approvals by other countries with comparable and recognised regulatory frameworks and institutional biosafety committees. As well as more agility to respond to scientific advances of new applications in a more timely manner. We do have
we're still in slide 1. Are you moving
Yep.
your slide?
That's fine. Yeah.
Okay,
That's fine.
wonderful.
Thank you. We do have a gene technology ministers meeting coming up in August this year, where a proposal for the scheme will be presented. So we're expecting a preliminary paper mid-July on that one. And we are very conscious as well of ongoing delays from our Department of Health here and have shared these concerns with our other regulatory bodies in that moving forward. So in terms of our national food regulatory system, the Australia-New Zealand Food Standards Code is the primary legislation that regulates genetically modified food and food ingredients in Australia and determines how agricultural biotechnology companies bring innovative new products to the Australian market. In addition to food safety assessments conducted by Food Standards Australia and New Zealand, agricultural technologies are regulated by the Office of the Gene Technology Regulator and the Australian Pesticides and Veterinary Medicines Authority, just to ensure that all products are associated and associated technologies meet statutory safety requirements. At the moment, as I mentioned, there are some inconsistencies with regulations across regulators, and it is desirable that consistency is achieved with these reviews that are currently ongoing. So amendments to the gene technology regulations in 2019 did clarify that the regulatory status of organisms that are not themselves categorised as GMOs but have been derived from GMOs do not match definitions under our Food Standards Code, which possesses unnecessary regulatory burden for products derived from SDN1 techniques, despite their deregulation in 2019. And the Office of the Gene Technology Regulator here has been clear that the definition of GMO in the Gene Technology Act does not include organisms derived from GMOs that have not inherited traits that occurred because of gene technology or null segregants. So that really highlights the importance of these consultations here at the moment. In terms of the FSAN's review of food derived using new breeding techniques, this one's particularly important going forward. And as I mentioned, the preliminary report with necessary changes released back in August 2018 has been delayed following requests for more stakeholder engagement. So this is one that we are really looking forward to here in Australia. With the final report of that released in December 2019, 3 key recommendations were made detailing how NBTs will be regulated and whether they will require pre-market approval in Australia. These were to revise and modernise the definitions in the code and make them clearer and better able to accommodate existing and emerging technologies. Another, to consider processes and non-process based definitions to ensure that NBT foods are regulated in a manner that is commensurate with risk they pose. And a third important one being to ensure transparency and raise awareness about GM and NBT foods. The evaluation process was completed and a new proposal to amend the definitions of the code commenced in February last year. However, the consultation has been delayed, and as I mentioned, we're expecting that mid this year. Another important review that I have touched on is the review of the Food Standards Australia-New Zealand Act, which is currently being conducted or considered by our Department of Health, having closed late last month. In terms of its status, in July 2020, the Department of Health launched this review with the aim being to consider operations and legislative changes that could assist Food Standards Australia and New Zealand to effectively deliver its statutory functions. We do feel that detail was lacking in this consultation in the paper itself. However, there's some interesting commentary there on FSAN's powers and the potential extension of these to the enforcement of food standards and recalls, data collection and communications about food safety, which is a particularly important one for the trade space, given that if things do go wrong, we don't want things to be taken out of context or appropriated by a trading partner, particularly with some sectors facing increasingly technical and phytosanitary barriers, which could subsequently increase the difficulty and cost of doing business and potentially create economic and compliance impacts for Australian growers, exporters, and the broader supply chain here in Australia. Following that overview of those consultations that are currently underway that have implications for our gene technology regulations here, I just thought I'd take a brief moment to touch on some of the successes that we've had more recently regarding our moratoria here in Australia around the production of GM crops, commercial production of GM crops. So in South Australia, the GM moratorium is now lifted on the mainland, however, does remain for Kangaroo Island. This is a huge success, which comes after years of advocacy and gives researchers and growers access to technology that has been available in other parts of our country for a long time. During this process of the lifting of the moratoria, 11 local government areas did apply to remain GM-free, however, none succeeded. And accreditation and training for growers and agronomists here in South Australia itself has taken off with, at the moment, around 350 of these accredited for the commercial production sale of GM seed. So the new GM legislation in South Australia does provide an incentive for researchers, breeders and farmers to trial GM crops under local conditions, which is a huge benefit to our sector here. And it also provides clarity for potential national and international investors in GM technologies. The New South Wales GM crop moratorium is also an important one, and it will expire on the 1st of July this year, following the government's decision not to continue that ban. With exemptions already in place in New South Wales, however, for a long time, the lifting of this moratorium should just be business as usual for our farmers and the agriculture sector here, but is a much needed and welcome change. This will bring New South Wales into line with all other mainland states in Australia, as well as our major international agricultural competitors. And we do believe that this will encourage stronger research and innovation and facilitate access to current and future GM crops approved for commercialisation in Australia. In terms of the global regulatory landscape, biotechnology does continue to gain momentum as a major focus for the world's policymakers. despite being one of the 13 nations on a joint issued statement to the World Trade Organization in 2018 that supported relaxed regulations for gene editing. No gene edited crops have been approved in Australia as yet. However, over the past 4 years, as well, several countries, including Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Israel, the US, have all clarified the regulatory status of gene-edited crops and their products, with those that do not incorporate foreign DNA currently regulated as conventional plants with no additional restrictions, which is different to the situation here in Australia. More recently, some of Australia's major trading partners, such as China and competitor nations, including Russia and Canada, have also indicated their interest in or are currently considering policy changes related to gene editing and products derived from NBTs. And for plant breeders and technology developers, research and development of NBTs with agricultural applications is of course possible in Australia for the most part. However, ambiguous and inconsistent regulation still makes it challenging to navigate this space in Australia. The primary constraint for this RD&E and commercialisation or lack thereof and products from these techniques is the regulatory and cost hurdles that are associated with assessment and the registration process here in Australia. So I'll conclude my presentation there, and just with a note that, you know, this is a really exciting time to be in the biotechnology space and driving regulatory change here in Australia and across the world, particularly at a time of unprecedented climate challenge. Plant breeding innovations such as gene technologies are vital tools that we can use towards more sustainable food production, creating healthier plants, healthier people, and a healthier planet overall. The scientific challenges have largely been settled, or at least there's a clear path to resolving them, according to scientists in the field, but there are definitely some political and social ones that remain, and that we will continue to work through. If these consultations that Australia are currently conducting are managed effectively and appropriate regulations adopted, we're really optimistic that there's great potential to truly harness these critical technologies. Thank you.
Yes, very well said. Thank you so much. Those last statements are the key messages of your talk, and thank you very much for providing us the state of play, what's happening in Australia in terms of regulation and the new breeding technologies, the products that are coming, and the excitement of some of the parts of Australia, just like the New South Wales, where we have stopped the ban and farmers are going to enjoy the freedom to plant vita-crops. Thank you so much, Lucy. Thank you. Now let's move on to our next speakers. Actually, we are now going to have a panel of speakers from Southeast Asia discussing about the NBT policy approaches and implications for markets and trade. So the first speaker would be from Malaysia, and this will be Professor Dr. Muhammad Faiz Pung bin Abdullah. He's the chairman of the Genetic Modification Advisory Committee and a regular participant and as expert in the CVD Open-Ended Online Expert Forum on Risk Assessment and Risk Management and Synthetic Biology. He is a lecturer in the Faculty of Applied Sciences in University of Technology, Mara, Shah Alam, and he got his degrees of microbiology from University of Malaya and obtained a PhD in molecular genetics from the University of Oxford. Let's welcome Professor Abdullah, please. You're mute, sir. Professor Abdullah, you're mute. Yeah,
Hello?
there you go.
Okay,
Yes,
okay, thank you.
now
Sorry
we can
about
hear
that.
you.
Okay.
Sure.
All right, I'll first introduce the current biosafety law in Malaysia and the regulating authorities before discussing how the law will affect NBT crops and what is the likely way forward for Malaysia. So NBT encompasses a range of new and emerging plant breeding technology. And at this point, I would say that we are mainly concerned with the first three on the list, namely gene editing, RNA inhibition, and synthetic biology. Not that the rest are not important, but these three technologies are already on the horizon. And especially in the case of gene-edited crops, there is a lot of attention and concern on how they will be regulated. The main focus today, I presume, will be on gene editing. So Malaysia has a Biosafety Act enacted in 2007, which regulate all living modified organisms, or LMO, and the release of products from such organisms. So the Safety Act is supported by the Biosafety Regulation 2010, which describe the operational details, and scope and procedures for approval and notifications. And two other regulations, the compounding of offences and sampling procedures, were introduced in 2018 to streamline operation and enforcement. So in general, the Biosafety Act and regulation were drafted in response to the Cartagena Protocol of Biosafety and is very much in line with the wordings of the protocol. So under the Biosafety Act, living modified organisms are defined as any living organism that possesses a novel combination of genetic material obtained through the use of modern biotechnology. So in this case, our regulatory trigger is process-based. So that is the process of modern biotechnology will require that the product goes through a regulatory process. And modern biotechnology is defined as in vitro nucleic acid techniques, including recombinant DNA and direct injection of nucleic acid into cells or organelles, or fusion of cells beyond the taxonomic family that overcome natural physiological reproductive or recombination barriers, and that are not techniques used in traditional breeding or selection. So again, the law is worded very comprehensively and would include almost anything that is produced using modern biotechnology. The regulating authorities for the biosafety law in Malaysia is the Ministry of Environment and Water. Okay, and under the ministry, the Department of Biosafety, or DOB, is in charge of all the operational, administrative, and enforcement dealings. They act as a one-stop center to receive application and notifications from interested parties. The decision-making body is the National Biosafety Board, the NBB, which approve application for approvals or notification. The NBB can also make decision on certain policy matters. And if the NBB cannot come to decision on an issue, then it will be escalated to the ministry level. In making a decision, the NBB takes into account mainly scientific and technical input and risk assessment provided by the Genetic Modification Advisory Committee, or GMAC. For approval of open release, public consultation is also sought, and where there are socio-economic concerns, there is also a socio-economic committee that will provide the input. So the National Biosafety Board is chaired by the head secretary to the Ministry of Environment and Water and comprises representatives from 7 other ministries, together with 4 external experts. So the Ministry of Health is there, the Ministry of Science, Agriculture, Plantation, Industry and Commodities, Ministry of International Trade and Industry, Ministry of Domestic Trade and Consumer Affairs, and the Ministry of Energy and Natural Resources. So the decision-making process is comprehensive and is joint jurisdictional with input from a range of agencies. So next, I'll quickly update on the status of genetic modified crops and products in Malaysia. So this is genetically modified in the traditional sense. They are not GE yet. So until now, there has been no application for commercial planting of GM crops, but for food feeds and processing and for sale of commodity, Malaysia has approved 50 events, the majority of which are corn and or maize, soybean, and cotton, which are mainly brought in to support the animal feed industry. Recently, we have also approved canola and potato. So this will give you a quick idea of what is the market opportunities in Malaysia if you decide to commercialize your product here. We also approve a few non-food feed and products, processing products, enzymes, larvicides, cut flowers, and so on, and also field trials for genetic modified mosquito and genetic modified papaya and rubber. So this is for genetic modified crops. For gene-edited crops, okay, so far there has been no application for open release or planting, and there has also been no application for commercialization of food feed and processing. Although we are aware that there are some activities on contained use research and development of these techniques in Malaysia, this is mainly innovative work, research work done by research institute and universities, and there are many currently in the R&D stage. They include techniques that uses CRISPR and Cas, and most of these on works on human cell lines, animal, and microbes. So far, there's only been one that one research group that is actively genetically editing crops. So with that in the background, I will move on to gene-edited crops and the regulation in Malaysia. For now, we have no specific policy for gene or genome editing. And the issue of GM crops is still under discussion, and until a decision is made, so all GE crops will be regulated under the Biosafety Act as modern biotechnology, as product of modern biotechnology. Okay, especially if they include the following characteristic, such as the use of modern biotechnology, the use of the techniques that involve manipulation of DNA, and involvement, the use of exogenous or foreign DNA, and where there is a genetic recombination that results in LMO. However, where there is scientific uncertainty, specific case of genetic edited crops can be evaluated on a case-by-case basis, as long as they're within definition of the regulatory scope. And these are the issues that's currently under discussion. We hope to conclude and come to decision soon. So on the ambiguity in regulating specific gene-edited plants that contain similar changes that can also occur naturally, and genetic edited plants that are produced using a combination of modern biotechnology and natural crossing. And also where the gene editing technique do not result in the integration of foreign DNA, and where the products from gene editing may not be reliably detect or monitor. And also some discussion is ongoing with regard to transient RNA deliver, RNA inhibition. So any of these cases that falls into the gray area or where there's scientific uncertainty can be submitted to the Department of Biosafety, and they can be assessed on a case-by-case basis as defined by the regulatory scope, based on the risk factor, and that will depend very much on the event and the intended use. So this is sort of a stopgap measure until we have a firm decision in place. Okay, so at Malaysia, the current situation is, I would say, discussion is still ongoing. Okay, as with the case of many other countries in the world. Okay, I believe that Philippines and Indonesia has made a decision, and I'm keen to listen to the next two speakers. Okay. All right, and this slide is just to show that I will along very much what is being conventionally accepted and regarded as scientific principles. So we are discussing along the line of genome editing and SDN1, SDN2, and SDN3, and which are the ones that could possibly be deregulated under the current regulations, and what are those that may have to be continue regulated under the current laws. Okay, so in conclusion, okay, so for now, open release and continuous activities for gene edited crops, okay, is still regulated by the existing regulatory framework. GE crops will be regulated as LMO if they fall under the jurisdiction of the current regulation. It's possible that simplified procedure may be developed in near future for NBT crops and can be applied on a case-by-case basis. Discussions have started at the scientific and technical level, and we hope to conclude soon. And that will be followed by a wider consultation and inputs that will be obtained to have a comprehensive framework that's ready to process future release. So you asked me about the outlook. I would say that the biosafety regulation framework in Malaysia has been facilitative and responsible, and I think that we are likely to maintain this direction. So with that, thank you. And if you have any further, you need any further clarification, you can contact the DOB on these platforms. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Abdullah. These are very comprehensive presentation on what's happening regulatory-wise in Malaysia. We know that currently there are still discussions, and it looks like things are going to go to the right direction, the correct direction, as we hope it to be. And so thank you so much. May I now ask everyone to please put your questions in the Q&A box Q&A function, not in the chat box, because we will be looking at the Q&A box. Thank you so much once again, and please stay put, Dr. Abdullah, for the Q&A in a few minutes after the two speakers. Now let's move on to the Philippines, and this would be our presenter would be Dr. Reynante Ordonio. He is a senior science research specialist and scientist one at the Philippine Rice Research Institute and the project leader of the Healthier Rice Project, a collaborative project with ERI on beta carotene enriched golden rice varieties, high iron and high zinc rice to address the problem of micronutrient deficiencies in the country. He was a member of the drafting committee to the Philippines Policy on Products of Plant Breeding Innovations and chair of the ad hoc technical working group of NBTs under the National Committee on Biosafety of the Philippines. He obtained his bachelor's, magna cum laude, and MS biology degrees from the Central Luzon State University. He was one of my students and later obtained additional MS and doctoral degrees in agriculture, science, agricultural science, and postdoctoral fellowship from Nagoya University in Japan. Let's welcome Dr. Ray Ordonio.
Yes, hello to everyone, and thank you so much, Ma'am Ola. Lovely to be here, and I would like to share with you this presentation on regulatory approach for products of NBTs in the Philippines. Let me first give you a brief introduction about the case of GMOs in the Philippines. The Philippines is a signatory to the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety to the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity since year 2000. And because of that, our existing regulatory framework reflects the principles of the Cartagena Protocol. Specifically, we define a GMO or LMO, just like the same with Malaysia, as a living organism created through modern biotechnology through such processes as recombinant DNA technology, direct injection of nucleic acids, or fusion of unrelated cells. And of course, they possess novel combination of genetic materials because of the process. As of now, the Philippines has 19 years of experience on GM regulation. This is from the creation of the Department of Agriculture, or DA, Administrative Order number 8 in 2002. Currently, however, the said AO number 8 has been replaced by the Joint Department Circular effective April 15, 2016. It is entitled Rules and Regulations for the Research and Development, Handling and Use, Transboundary Movement, Release into the Environment, and Management of Genetically Modified Plant and Plant Products derived from the use of modern biotechnology. And it is being implemented by the Department of Science and Technology, Department of Agriculture, of course, DNR, or Department of Environment and Natural Resources, Department of Health, and the Department of Interior and Local Government. Now, this is the regulatory process for GMOs in the Philippines. After genetic transformation in the laboratory, the lead event and backup events are determined in the screen house. The best candidate lines for the lead event in terms of the intended trait and agronomic performance and pest and disease response are then determined through a confined test. Further additional performance and environmental safety parameters are assessed during the multi-location field trial. It is also at this stage that materials for food, feed, or for processing application is generated. There will also be an application for permit for commercial propagation. This permit essentially approves or deregulates the event. And so the line can then go through varietal registration and subsequent deployment, but still following defined stewardship protocols. Now, talking about the earlier three stages, the laboratory, screenhouse, and confined test, these are actually under the purview of the Department of Science and Technology Biosafety Committee. Here in this slide, it is easy to see that the early stages of development of all products of modern biotech in the Philippines is covered by the DOST-BC. They had been taking the lead in evaluating and monitoring regulated articles under contained use since 2009. Then for the later stages, that will be the concern of the Department of Agriculture Bureau of Plant and Industry. And in their case, they issue such permits as propagation permits and permit for direct use as food and feed or for processing. And again, this regulatory process is established for the purpose of ensuring the safety or biosafety because of their perceived risks associated with the novel combination of genetic materials that they possess. Now, in 2018, in view of the exciting developments involving new plant breeding techniques and their potential impact on international trade, the Department of Agriculture Biotech Program Office initiated a study group to look into the state of the art of NBTs and review them from the viewpoint of regulation. Now, fast forward to 2021, we already have the first ever NCBP resolution on NBTs, which was just signed last April. NCBs in the Philippines. The resolution is entitled the
Ray,
Regulation
excuse
of
me,
Plant
Ray.
and Plant Products Derived from the
Ray, can you turn off your video?
Yes.
You are choppy. We cannot hear you properly. Can you turn off your video so that your voice would be fuller? Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah,
I hope it's
better.
okay
Yeah.
now.
Yes.
Okay. The NCBP, or the National Committee on Biosafety of the Philippines, provides oversight to all genetic engineering experiments in the Philippines. The resolution is entitled here. This is actually the output of a technical working group in June 2019 that was chaired by yours truly. Then, okay. The contents of the resolution is based on this decision tree, which we also came up with. We examined 8 different NBTs based on the possibility of producing novel combination of genetic materials in the final product. And these techniques are site-directed nucleases. There's 1, 2, 3. And then oligonucleotide-directed mutagenesis, ODM, cisgenesis and intragenesis, RNA-dependent DNA methylation, grafting with GM material, reverse breeding, agroinfiltration of nuns, and also agroinoculation of germline tissues with cis insert, and lastly, synthetic genomics. As a result, we found that all of the NBTs are capable of producing non-GMOs, while of them, 4 have an intermediate GM stage, but still the product, after breeding out the inserts or the transgenes or vectors, they become non-GMOs. And 3 of them, as shown in PBI case 2, can give rise to a GMO. And these techniques are SDN3 with trans-insert, agroinfiltration of germline tissues with trans-insert, and synthetic genomics involving trans-like sequence integration. And so the resolution basically states that products with no foreign DNA insertion will be exempted from GM regulation or the Joint Department Circular. For NBT products being developed in the country, we expect that the initial stages of their product development will be covered by the GM regulation under the purview of the Department of Science and Technology Biosafety Committee until they are granted exemption by the Department of Agriculture Bureau of Plant and Industry through a certificate of non-coverage or simply appearance. For products developed outside the country, like coming from Australia, for example, we expect that the DA or DABPI may issue the same certificate of non-coverage. But as of now, the DA is yet to come up with the specific guidelines for their evaluation and monitoring of NBT products. For now, I can just share with you 2 slides from the DA, which gives us a glimpse of the possible evaluation process at DA later on. And you see here, first, there will be determination of the PBI or NBT product if it contains a transgene, and this will be via the DABC. And then if no transgene, there will just be food and feed or only food safety assessments that will apply. And this will not be as rigorous as in the JDC, like using proximate analysis only by BPI and Bureau of Animal Industry or DPI only. Or if there is no transgene, there will just be an outright issuance of clearance that the product can be used as food or feed and be propagated with no further regulations if there are no biosafety issues. Number 4, environmental safety assessment will be done if the product will be grown in the Philippines, and this will be under the purview of the BPI. And lastly, issuance of clearance instead of certificate of safety issued by BPI or other competent office at DA. And this is also the proposed process flow for the formal assessment or determination of PBI or NBT products intended for commercial use, either for food, feed, or for processing or for propagation. Basically, the technology developer submits the application to the Bureau of Plant Industry Biotech Secretariat, which then assesses the document for its completeness. And if it is complete, it will be submitted or forwarded to the DA Biosafety Committee, which then decides if the product will be covered by the existing GMO regulation or not. And then the decision will be passed on to the BPI director, and then the BPI director will then feed back to the technology developer. And now for some key takeaways. The Philippines has a regulatory policy through an NCBP resolution on products of new plant breeding techniques, but the fine details are still to be developed by the Department of Agriculture. Now, for products of NBTs that do not possess foreign DNA insertions or novel combination of genetic materials, the existing GM regulation or JDC will not apply. Then any product coming from Australia would follow a determination step if it is going to be covered by the GM regulation or not. And lastly, once the NBT policy specific guidelines are formalized by the DA, a certificate of non-coverage or clearance can be obtained from DABPI for products that are non-GM coming from NBTs. That's all, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ray Ordonio. These are very comprehensive points on what's happening in the Philippines, and we're happy to note that now we already have the regulatory policy to be polished by the Department of Agriculture. Thank you so much once again. Now let's move forward to our next speaker, who is now from Indonesia, and this is Dr. Bambang Prasetya, is the chairman of the Indonesia Biosafety Committee for genetically modified organism, which provides a recommendation for biosafety on new plant breeding and microorganisms, food, feed, and their derivative products to the Ministry of Agriculture, Ministry of Environment and Forestry, and Head of Drugs and Food Safety of Indonesia. He obtained his bachelor's degree from Bogor University and got his master's and PhD from Georg August University of Göttingen, Germany. Let's welcome Dr. Bambang Prasetya.
Thank you. Welcome.
Can you make it a slideshow, please, Dr.
Yes,
Bambang?
slideshow. Yes, me. Can you see?
Yes, thank you so
Yes,
much.
thank you very much. First of all, thank you for kind of introduction with Dr. Aldimita. I would like to share my presentation entitled Status of Regulation, Development and Product derived from genome editing. The term is, I think, the same, is the new technique breeding. My presentation will be after I introduce this right? I would like to share about the regulation, procedure, and assessment system, and brief picture. And can I close my what is? Sorry, the sound is not so well.
No, it's okay. The sound
It's
is
okay.
good.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then I also share with about the procedure and assessment system, brief picture about the trade in Indonesia, and also I would like share my opinion about the strategy of genome editing. Just for the introduction, there are a number of the challenges such as the decreasing environmental problem, global warming, population issues concerning number of the population and health quality, decreasing number, including the decreasing quality of crop agriculture land, and emerging disease is also natural disaster. Compared to the conventional and existing technology, as shown in the picture in the right side, about the milestone of breeding technique, genome editing have a much very potential tools in biotechnology. I think it is due to more effective, more relative short time, and also cheaper compared with existing GM technology. And the development of genome editing has been developed rapidly, is shown by increasing number of activity of research, number of publication, number of patent registered. Moreover, the genome editing can open broader opportunities, especially in for the developing country like Indonesia and maybe our friend. And also based on this fact, Indonesia thinks that the providing of suitable regulation is very important to boost the development of the GN and utilization of a product. Now I will move to the regulation. This slide shows the timeline of regulation and our achievement in biosafety recommendation and certification. There are series of platform regulation derived from the CBD and Cartagena Protocol, and one of them is, I think, in Indonesia, we released the Government Act, President Act, we call PP number 21, 2005, and then continued by Act number 39, 2010, and 53, 2014. It is about organization structure and authority and task, as well as function of the Biosafety Committee. And recently, from the Ministry of the Agriculture, released the regulation about the control and monitoring for the GM product. This is very important for us also. And parallel to this, I would like to share that starting from 2011, we start release the recommendation for the GM product. Until we have already 76 certification, including ongoing process, and once in this year for the genome editing product. So I move to the national consolidation for the formation of regulation. Beginning with our analysis and our group study, and we review international portfolio about the genome editing, and then we have a certain FGD with invite several experts from the regulator, from the international expert. We invite from Japan, for Argentina, from Australia also, from the International Rice Research Institute in Philippines. Finally, we have already a decision about disposition of the genome editing, and is now preparing to the making of the guideline. In this picture is also the situation about the focus discussion, and also here some two paper from the Ibu Bahagiawati, Mr. Bahagiawati also released about the position, the regulation of Indonesia, and me also, Mit Satya Nugraha, also have a review about this position. And the basic concept of genome editing, the first is that the end product contain no foreign gene. It is our decision. And based on the classification of SDN, site-directed nuclease, SDN1 and SDN2, a question mark, depend on the end product contain gene foreign gene or not. And then assessment done by technical assessment, technical committee about the characterization of molecular and phenotype. This point we coming and conclude that in short, the genome editing, we exclude genome editing technology from the existing regulation from the GM product. Even it is the theme is the same, the assessment the same is in the GM product. And the decision whether the product belong to the GA or the GM product based on the technical assessment from the Biosafety Commission and also the plenary meeting in the international committee. We have supporting team. For example, for the technical team from the Biosafety for Food, it is in the National Agency for Drug and Food Control, technical team for Biosafety for Food in the Ministry of Agriculture, technical team for Biosafety Environment from the Ministry of Environmental and Forestry, and also we have also team for Law and Social Culture and Economic Assessment, and special for the genome editing, we have set up a team cross-functional from the technical meeting who has the background of biological molecular. We already set up. And just short for the regulation of genome editing, the applicant sent the proposal to the Ministry of MOA, Ministry of Agriculture, Environmental and Forestry, and also National DFC. It is for the food security. Depend on the type of the recommendation. It is whether feed or food or environmental biosafety. And then the next step, the application will be sent to the Biosafety Committee and start the assessment process. The technical assessment will be carried out by the team Biosafety, and the result by the assessment will be sent to the plenary meeting from the Biosafety Committee and discuss, and then we can decide whether it is accepted or not. And then when we accept it, we send again recommendation to the ministry. It is the simple way, but actually every step is contains several steps also, but it is the main story. And special for the assessment, this is very important. The start assessment consists following question. First, starting with question: is there any genetical material? And then with the answer no, we come to the next question: is any transgene in the process? When no, that is the product belong to the non-GMO. When is the transgenic content in the product in presumed, and then the question is in the end product free of the transgene? When not, direct to the scheme of the GMO, GMP we call genetic modified products. When no, belong to the scheme of GMO. So this is the main of our regulation. And for the non-GMO, so can directly to the releasing by after getting a licensing from the authority, from the Ministry of Agriculture, Ministry of Forestry, and also from the National Agency Food Control. And the task from the Biosafety Committee, the first important thing is to provide the biosafety GM product recommendation for our authority, Ministry of Agriculture, and we have also certification. We have also provided the guidance, and also we have task to assist them, especially in the supervision and importation of the utilization of PRG of GM product. Talking about genome editing technology, it is maybe must be related to the our condition of the production and import in Indonesia. We imported in several kind of product, but we also produce very strong in the malt rice and also corn. Self-sufficient malt rice production in Indonesia and also corn last year, maybe almost sufficient, and then it still in little portion of soybean production, but the import, the big one is from the soybean and derivative product, and also from wheat. It is the overview the production of trade and crop. For example, this is a comparison between production, import, and export for certain important crop, maize, rice, corn. As we know all, but the soybean and soybean meal is very hard be imported from the foreign country. That's mostly 80% is GM product. This is my last slide. that my opinion that genome editing belong to promising technology due to relatives very simple, cheaper, and shorten and compared with GM technology. Genome editing have a good perspective to strengthening the food quality, and regulation will be open flexibility and more acceptability by the people, Indonesian people especially, compared with GM product. And then genome editing will open potential collaboration, G to G, government to government, institution to institution, also maybe very private company to private company. Then collaboration is very effective in Indonesia when starting from the research and maybe and the licensing and the joint venture and joint production also in the market. And lastly, the genome editing, I think, will boost the utilization of potential our biodiversity for viable product. The slide also I saw the potential partner in Indonesia to make collaboration in the development of genome editing. Our research center, the potential one is the Research Center Biotechnology and Bioresource Genetics in Ministry of Agriculture, Research Center Biotechnology, and also Research Center Biotechnology and Bioindustry, Research Center Biotechnology and Indonesian Institute of Science, and also some research center from the university, for example, State University Jember and IPB University, and also Gajah Mada University, and also from the Industry Plant Research Center belong to the Ministry of the Agriculture. The focus area of the research is rice, orange, chili, sugar, cane, and or palm and earth mission. I think will be broader, and then we starting the research become interesting, and the government now have a new institution we call the Indonesian Innovation Center. It is, I think, very important to make how to develop GA in Indonesia. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bambang. And we are happy to note that Indonesia is also gearing up towards genome editing or NBT product policies, which would allow Indonesians to harness the benefits of this technology. Thank you so much. Currently, there are so many questions, and I know that we are running out of time, but we need to tackle this very important question. So we'd like to introduce our global coordinator, Dr. Mahalakshmi Arojanan, to moderate our Q&A portion. So she is a renowned science communicator in agri-biotechnology. She has received numerous recognitions and is a member of the advisory committee for biotech in the Malaysian government, industry advisory panel for 7 universities, the Cornell Alliance for Science, Farming Future Bangladesh, and Mustafa Science and Technology Foundation for Women. She has a PhD in Science Communication, Master of Biotech from University of Malaya, and BS in Microbiology from University Putra, Malaysia. So let's welcome Dr. Maha.
Thank you, Dr. Aldamita. Thank you so much for all the very enriching presentations. We learned a lot, and I'm sure this will be creating a momentum for gene-edited products. Now, being a moderator is not easy because if we don't have questions, we have to make up the questions, and now I'm spoiled for choice. So I'm going to use my discretion as a moderator to choose the question. Now, I was eyeing on this question as a first question, but I see that Adil has answered this, but I think this is really important. So I'm going to bring this question again from Dr. Nurwati Adnan from Malaysia. And she's asking, what's your opinion related to harmonization process in Southeast Asian countries? I think this is really important, and I want other presenters to also put in your perspective. So Adil has responded, and he has given Latin American example as a good case study for Southeast Asian countries. But how can we take it to reality? What can countries, individual countries do? Anyone wants to take this up? Including the panelists from the 3 countries.
Hi, Maso. Can I answer this?
Sure.
Yeah. So with regard to individual countries, I think it is dependent on taking a mission approach towards regulations. Right now, what happens is that these regulations, they're evolving in silos. So if there is more crosstalk between different departments, understanding what their objectives and assessments are at the end of the day, you move towards creating a national level of legislation. Then obviously the second level is looking at regional forums. So we all, different states have regional organizations. you push that agenda. For example, in Southeast Asian country, ASEAN forum is the best one. So you do a discussion related to regulations on that forum, and then through that regional representation, you go towards the UN forums as well. So this is how you create a leadership in the longer run. But it begins at increasing crosstalk between your sub-state organizations, including universities, relevant regulatory offices, and understanding what is this mindset of the regulator at the end of the day, and how you can effectively answer them.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Adil. So we really need to work on a platform, but we also need individual countries to take up this challenge, right? Because we have been talking about this even for genetic modification or genetic engineering. It's a tall order. So we hope individual countries will also come up, and this will definitely reduce trade barriers and collaboration. Now, the other interesting question is from Dr. Deepa, I suppose Dr. Deepa Navanath from India. Now, she's asking, what is the regulatory process for genetic gene edited? Is it the same as genetic modification? So we are always talking about, is it going to be regulated or not regulated? How about the regulatory process itself, all the analysis and testing done? Is it going to be the same, or how different is it going to be? Mike, do you want to take this question?
Okay, thanks. Well, it depends on the nature of what you're looking at. So SDN1 gene editing without any introduced DNA, it's hard to see why this should be regulated as GM. It's quite different. Now, first of all, but I would preface this by the fact that there's actually nothing wrong with GM itself, and 11% of the world's food is actually from GM crops anyway. So if we say that, but I mean, there are more issues related to that. But if there is no introduced DNA, why on earth should it be treated any differently from conventional breeding, which after all is also providing new combinations of genetic material? That's the whole point of conventional breeding. And there are many things which are not logical. For example, a crop like triticale is a completely artificial crop, a combination of wheat and rye that doesn't exist in nature. There's no regulation there. If you buy bread in Australia, it's probably got genes from rye in it for resistance to stem and leaf rust, and those are transferred by cytogenetic means and not by recombinant DNA, and so they're not regulated, but they're clearly they're GM. So there are some inconsistencies here. But if you get to certainly SDN1 products or SDN2, where they're essentially you could achieve that same, may well be able to achieve the same outcome through conventional breeding, then there's absolutely no reason why those should be regulated as GM crops.
Thank you, Mike. I think that answered the questions, at least 3 questions put forward here by Shahid Ahmad. From the question, Shahid Ahmad, I see that you want gene-edited crops to be regulated. And I'm going to take your questions, but Professor Mike Jones already addressed some of it. And your question is why gene-edited crops are not treated as GM. I think Mike responded to the question. You also asked questions like, is GM or gene-edited crops, when they are internationally traded, are they going to be supported by data or information? I think what you're asking is, will data or the information about the product accompany these gene-edited products when they are internationally traded? So, Mike, do you want to take this question as well? How different will the trade be for gene-edited products?
Well, to be perfectly honest, if they're deregulated, there's no reason for them to be treated any differently than conventional crops that are traded. So that's how I would see the regulations, the logical way that regulations should go. We certainly don't want another tier of regulation for GE crops. That would be completely counterproductive. So the same sort of information that has to be provided by people who trade in conventional crops, that's the same sort of information that would be provided for GE crops if they're being deregulated. And we certainly this would be just yet another barrier to trade, which I don't think is very helpful.
Yep, sure. Thank you, Mike. And here's a question from Shipra. She's asking, is there a list of commercially approved genome-edited SDN1 crop globally? So maybe a database. I don't know if Ola wants to answer this question.
Sorry, I'm responding to some questions in the chat box. Can you ask me again? What's the question?
Yeah, the question from Shipra is there a list of commercially approved genome-edited SDN1 crop globally?
Okay, currently we are really trying to have one, but we have still to look at where they are, what they are. Since most of the SDN1 crops do not pass through regulation, so it's very hard to track, because some of them are considered, well, all of them are considered to be conventional. So what we can do is just to have a roster of what these are, but not how much area is planted to this. So that is really possible. The trait, the crops, which are SDN1 derived, and the company which produced that could be possible. But of course, we need to have funds to have it. If you will help us to get it. Thank you.
Sure, ISA is willing to do that, but if there is fund provided. Now I'm going to move on to addressing public acceptance. Here's a question from Sasha to Prof. Jones, but Adil, please jump in as well. I'm going to combine two questions here. One is from Sasha, who is asking, how would you address public acceptance? And there is another question, how would you counter the negative influence on GE from the EU negative influences on GE regulations, which this person feels is not science-based? Adil? Oh, Mike.
Yeah. So at the end of the day, that's the magic bullet, getting people to accept technology. So consumer perception, in any way, it's changing, but it's a lot dependent on three different levels. First, how scientists are effectively able to communicate their innovations and technologies. Like, are they getting the message across? At times, people feel overwhelmed by the jargon. At the second level, are policymakers, abreast of the developments that are taking place at the international level? What happens at times is that, the communication that reaches them is not presented in a simplified or a tangible manner. And thirdly, how the international regimes, they understand the proliferation of, or the commercialization of biotechnology at large. So at these three different levels, at the end of the day, consumer perception is based on how these three levels will evolve. Then on a related note, it's also about how the EU negative perception. So that's changing as well. There's been a lot of, there's been official publications as well that scientists have advocated that, to move towards the science-driven agenda. But at the end of the day, there will be different lobby groups. So what can effectively be done at the level of the scientists is accurate science communication and advocacy. At the level of, the policy stakeholders, more science diplomacy. Scientists and policymakers talking together and creating new forms of dialogues where, one side is not overwhelmed by the other. So that is how basically you can provide evidence to the perception of the people.
Mike, do you want to add on?
Yes,
especially on EU.
Sorry. Well, first of all, I just adding that my experience, we were asked to by Horticulture Innovation Australia to review potential acceptance of GE products in the vegetable industry in Australia. We talked from everyone from breeders, scientists, breeders to marketers and so on. And virtually they all said, well, look, if we'd love to use this technology, but as long as it's not defined as GM. So if you then, if it's deregulated and it's not GM, then they're happy to use it. Now in Europe, well, there's a special case because the way that they come to their agreements, first of all, you've got 27 odd countries there, and they have trouble coming to agreements, as you can see with the COVID situation, for example. And also that they have non-governmental organizations which lobby the governments there and the decision makers, and they provide a lot of disinformation, to be perfectly honest. So it's very hard for them to get clear information. Also, you have to have confidence in the regulators. And if you have confidence in your regulators and the evidence is that something is completely safe, then you'll get better acceptance. But also I should add that there is a strong push by all the scientists and researchers and organizations in Europe to have the decision that has been made on SDN1 gene editing as being GM in Europe, have that reversed. So there's a lot of pushback at the moment. So personally, I would not be surprised if that pushback doesn't result in a change in legislation in due course. And as soon as you have something is deregulated, it's not GM, then the acceptance will automatically follow, I believe.
Yep. Now, I would like to also turn to the three panelists from the three countries we have here. What is being done in your country? Very briefly, we are not going to lobby for GM, we are not going to be lobbying for gene-edited products, but then like what Prof. Jones was saying, how can we instill trust in regulations and also promote technology, science-based technologies? Prof. Faiz, do you want to go?
Right, thank you. I think first and foremost, being open is important. So there should be a lot of conversation on this aspect in the social media or on any media platform. Okay, describing both the advantage and disadvantage. Okay. So and I strongly believe that educating the next generation is important, because after all, we have a law because the people want a law. Okay. So if the people understand that GE products can be beneficial despite whatever potential risks that can be mitigated, then I think acceptance will be on the rise in that way. So I would go for educating the public.
Thank you, Dr. Faiz. Dr. Ray?
Yes, yeah, I believe that.
Dr. Ray, you are a bit choppy again. You might want to switch off your video. Dr. Ray? Dr. Ray, you are choppy. Please switch off your video for a... Dr. Ray? Okay, while waiting for him, I'm going to move on to Pak Bambang from Indonesia. Dr. Ray, just please switch off your video. I'll come back to you.
Yes, thank you for the question. In case Indonesia, I think same with Malaysia. First point is important to make awareness from the regulator and also for the people. This is very important, and I'm sure that this GA building awareness is much more easier than the GM, because when already scientifically understand, so it is easy to educate the people. So maybe for Indonesia, because it's already once is the application, and then we can release, and then maybe this will be waiting of the assessment. And the research of this of Indonesian research maybe beside the for foreign product done it very intensively. Then and take time, maybe 2 or 2 years, 3 years ago, 3 years coming. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Pak Bambang. Dr. Ray, you want to try again?
Yes, hello, Maha. Yeah,
Yes,
I believe that public acceptance is really key to the success of an NBT product or even a GM crop later on. And for that reason, we are observing transparency in the regulatory process. As applicant, we show the public that the documents are submitted to the regulators, and the regulators approve it through a certain process. So we want to instill trust of the public to the institution also, to PhilRes or to IRRI, for example. And we want to show them that as scientists are really developing products for the sake of the public. And what matters to us is really safety, after all. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Ray. I think what is important is also, since most countries are in the process or stage of developing the new regulations or strategies, maybe a wide scale of consultation involving all stakeholders will also be helpful. So still on social acceptance, I've got another question here. Do we have any extensive study on social acceptability of gene-edited plants in Asia? I think, Ola, you are smiling. I'm sure you will say we will be happy to do. ISA did it in 2003, 2005. We did a large scale public on genetic engineering or genetic modification. We will be very happy to do, and I'm sure Murdoch will be very happy to do. All we need is funding. Okay, I have a technical question, regulatory questions from Celia Chalam. Now, SDN1 is deregulated in Australia. How about SDN2 and 3? And do you think SDN2 and 3 will be deregulated? Will it, Mike, you want to take this question?
Okay, well, SDN1 at the moment is deregulated, and as I understand it, SDN2 and SDN3 are not deregulated. That could, I think that's it. It depends. I think it will depend, though, and I think with further discussion, it will depend exactly on what has been introduced and how much, for example. So I believe at one point, and maybe Dr. Ray can answer this, but for example, in Philippines, they're considering that SDN2 with 19 bases introduced was accepted, but if you had more than 20 bases, then it was regulated as a GM. So there's sort of issues like that as to what for SDN1, how many bases should one be concerned about, and what might be their origin. But I think that if you took that on a case-by-case basis, you should get there should be deregulation of many products. And I mean, just take, if you take the science background, you say, well, wheat's got 17 billion bases in it, and we eat hundreds of bases of genes a day. One base in 17 billion, or 2 or 5 or 1 gene, actually makes absolutely no difference to the food that you eat. So a lot of this is a very esoteric discussion, which for some reasons doesn't take place for conventional food, where there's all sorts of changes like that going on, rearrangements, duplications, and so on. So I think there's over-regulation of GE products at the moment, and we have to work our way through that.
Yeah.
Can I just clarify?
Yes, please, Ray.
Yeah, for SDN2 in the Philippines, it doesn't mean that once it exceeds 20 base pairs or become base pairs, it's automatically considered as GM. What we're pushing is that aside from that determination of small change in the DNA or small insertion, there should also be homology testing through the sequence. We're pushing for SDN2 as having only a maximum of 19 base pairs for simplicity in the regulation, because we don't want to have a pile of applications that are actually not really meant to be reviewed so much, but then they pile up because they're branded as SDN3. So we want a fast lane for them so that they will not be over-regulated. So we want that SDN2 will not be regulated, provided that there is just a minimum, or a maximum of 19 base pairs in it. For the SDN3, or once it gets to 20 base pairs, then it will automatically be moved to SDN3, and that will be a case-by-case analysis considering the homology as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for that information. Now, still on deregulations, I've got another question from Sonic Lin, and the question is, since SDN1 is deregulated by OGTR, what are the policy or discussions related to separating this non-GM, which is actually gene-edited products, from the supply chain of organic products? Lucy, do you want to take this question? Lucy?
Sorry, so Lucy has left. Maybe, yes.
Yeah,
If you like, I could pick up on that.
Please, Mike.
Yes.
Well, for example, in Australia, in Western Australia, we have GM and non-GM canola. And so that's now routinely segregated and sold either as non-GM or GM. So, I mean, exactly the same could be done for organic if that were required. And we segregate large different categories of wheat and different categories of barley, whether it's malting quality or not, whether it's got high protein level or for feed. Those are all segregated in the system very effectively. So I don't think there's any reason why one could not segregate organic produce if that was desired.
Mm-hmm. Okay, still on organic, there's another question here on how strong is organic farming lobby in Australia that are likely to affect GMOs? Mike?
Oh, well, of course, there's also a lot of noise from the organic side. And if you go into your supermarket, you'll see the organic lane. But actually, the area, the broad scale agriculture in Australia is non-organic. So the broad scale wheat and barley and canola are not organic. So on a small scale, there's organic crops. And the lobby there is, again, it's disproportionately loud because, in fact, they use about 50% of the same chemicals as conventional agriculture, not even talking about GM. So copper sulfate can be used as an organic compound. I mean, that doesn't make a lot of sense. So, but the lobby is quite strong and vociferous, as in other countries. But I think you have to look at it. But in terms of a percentage of production, it's still relatively small.
Thank you, Mike, for mentioning that. And I always tell, why do you spend so much when the same chemicals are used for organic as well? Now, I've got a very specific question to Professor Abdullah here, Dr. Faiz Abdullah. And I think this, although it is about GM, but in the future, I think it will also relate to GE. The approval conditions for GM products in Malaysia comes with conditions that are imposed on the applicant. But these conditions are not under the control of the applicant. For example, cleaning up spills. Can GMAC review this requirement and recommend a more rational approach to approval conditions currently imposed on all applicants for GM crop approval?
Okay, thank you for the question. I believe that most countries will have some kind of regulation if, a container carrying hundreds of thousands of tons of GM corn overturned on the road and spill the content. So that will certainly have some environmental risks. And there will be regulation to clean that up. I think in Australia, there will be the transporter is required to clean up and even dig up the soil 6 inches or something like that. So that was the condition that the Department of Biosafety imposed. And this is actually due to an exemption. We actually applied a simplified approach provided under the biosafety legislation to facilitate the procession approval for the purpose of food feed and processing. So, and because of that, there's a gap in the responsibility and compliance to the terms and conditions. So as far as I know, the Department of Biosafety is in discussion with the relevant regulatory authorities, including the truckers, the shippers, and so on, and see how to transfer this specific responsibility to the importer through related permits. So we are working on that, and hopefully we can resolve this in due time.
Thank you, Dr. Faiz. We are now moving on to GE animals. I've got a question here. With GM salmon now in the market place in North and South America and potential GE animals coming through our research and development stage now, will there be acceptance and assessments for GE animals? Adil or Mike?
Can I respond to that?
Yes, sure. Ola, please go ahead.
Okay, I'm involved in the animal biotechnology on GE, and it looks like most of the GM animals are not getting into the market, and it's only our salmon, our Aqua Bounty salmon, which is a GM, which has reached the market. So most of our animal biotechnologists looking at the way GE or GNED or genome edited animals are being developed and acceptance is looking very good. Looks like most of our animal biotechnologists will be using genome editing at this point. So we cannot look back anymore at genetic engineering of crops. Scientists are looking forward to genome editing.
Thank you, Ola. I've got a question here on mutagenesis from David Tribe. Hi, David. So here is the question. Will recent development in high throughput, I think it's high throughput, conventional mutagenesis bypass GM regulatory barriers and doing what gene-edited products does, but less cleanly? Will this change the discussion? So basically, with the high throughput conventional mutagenesis, bypassing the GM regulatory and GE products and doing what GE products does, but of course less cleanly, will this change this discussion? Who's answering this question? Mike, yes?
Well, I don't know the answer, of course. I don't really know about high throughput mutagenesis, but I mean, it should change it, because if that's not regulated, then there's absolutely no reason why more precise gene regulated products should be regulated. So I mean, I think in a way that would affect it in a positive way, and it should also help promote acceptance. Unless, of course, people wanted to decide that conventional mutagenesis is actually GM. Presumably it won't go that way.
Yeah, I had a question on, yes, Adil?
Can I just give my opinion?
Sure.
Regarding...
Oh, Dr. Ray, yes.
Yeah, the mutagenesis, high throughput mutagenesis. After all, it's just mutagenesis and there's no insertion. And so that should be within the realm of conventional breeding. So it's not regulated. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ray. I'm looking for this question on capacity building from Professor Jenny. Let me get that question, because I think it's so important that we tackle capacity building. Oh, is that answered? Maybe that's answered already then. Okay, Anita has got a question for Lucy, but she has left. She's got a question for Prof. Jones. What are the types of GE crops that are in the pipeline that may be commercialized in Australia?
Well, a lot of that is commercial in confidence, so I can't really answer that question. But I know, for example, that people were working on frost tolerance in wheat. For example, the work that we have going on improving the nutritional property of potatoes. These are all things in the pipeline, and I'm sure that all the major breeding companies and the CSRO are actually working towards developing GE crops. So, but it's they will be, for this on the whole, they're the same sort of things that would be aims in conventional breeding, but there will be things for improved human health, like changing oil content, changing protein content, reduced anti-nutritional compounds or toxic compounds present. That's a very large area, for example, removing naturally present toxic compounds. So we have a project in that area on quinoa on removing anti-nutritionals and saponins just started. So those sorts of things are in the pipeline, but they haven't come out of the other end yet, though hopefully they won't.
There was a question from Pak Bambang. I think he was asking what drives, Mike, you were saying now that more smaller private sector companies are coming into the space of developing gene edited products. What is driving this force?
Sorry, I'm not sure about the event, but it is come from the Research Center for Biotechnology and Resource Genetics, and from the Ministry of from the Research Center, belong to the Ministry of Agriculture, not from the private company.
Okay, that's Indonesia, right?
Indonesia, yeah.
That's Indonesia. But I was asking about, I think this question is to Prof. Jones, Mike. Because your presentation said that there are a number of companies, smaller companies coming into this space. So what is driving this?
Well, it's because if you deregulate SDN1, then it means you can just use those products. Those products can be treated as any plant breeding. So if you have a small company which couldn't afford to meet the regulatory requirements for GM crops, they can meet them because, in fact, then becomes no different from conventional breeding. So any small breeding company, State Department of Agriculture or a university breeding program can now use these technologies, and the costs and the path to market are just so much less than they would have been if it was labeled GM. So then that attracts additional investment and additional opportunities for the people who see those opportunities.
Mm-hmm. Now, Dr. Fusao from Japan, he has given some information here. GABA-rich tomato will come up in the market in Japan soon. Congratulations. We have listened to many presentations on this tomato, and we are waiting for that. There's a question from Marilyn. She's asking, do you think the diversity of crops can be affected by the introduction of GE crops? The same issue, the same questions we have been answering for decades on GM. Is it any different for GE?
I can answer. Well, if you, I would say it's no different. I mean, than conventional breeding. The bottleneck in breeding and in germplasm has happened a long time ago as we have domesticated wild species and then intercrossed and so on. And there's a narrowing down of the genetic base. Now that's got nothing to do with GE or GM, because in fact, in many cases, those new traits are added to elite varieties which have been developed through conventional breeding. So I don't see that the GE or GM should actually change that situation at all.
And Australia, you have so many invasive crops brought by Europeans many years ago.
Well, actually, every crop is an invasive crop apart from macadamia nuts. There's only one crop which is indigenous to Australia, and that's macadamia nut. And all other crops, all the germplasm has been imported from elsewhere, and that continues to be the case. So we're used to importing lots of material from all over the place.
Mm-hmm. Ola, do we still have time? Or tell me when? Okay, so I think I have to stop here, and thank you so much for all the questions. And I'm sorry if I was not able to pick up your questions. There are just so many questions. Thank you so much. And thank you to the speakers and the panelists. Back to Ola.
Thank you so much, Dr. Maha. And I know that there's a very interesting exchange going on, but we have to stop. And I'd like to invite everyone to please look at the chat box for the post-webinar survey. So this is going to be your ticket to get your certificate. Some of you already responded to the pre-webinar survey. So we now have the post-webinar survey, and please respond to it, and we'll give you the certificates. I'm not going to talk any longer because we have already surpassed our time. But first, I'd like to, can we have a gallery here? If we can have all the panelists pictured in the view, so that we can give them a big thanks, of course, to our co-hosts at this point, Professor Michael Jones, Adil, Mohammed, and Lucy has already left. Professor Abdullah, Professor Dr. Bambang Prasetya, and Dr. Ordonio. Thank you so much for being very excellent panelists. You have provided us very comprehensive presentations, and we have been enlightened so much with all your presentations, especially the countrywide, the Australia, and the Southeast Asia scenarios. We'd also like to congratulate our webinar moderator, of course, Maha, for putting all of this together. I know it's very tough, but you did it very well. And I would like to invite everyone to have if you're not yet a subscriber to our Crop Biotech update, please subscribe. So we have our Crop Biotech update here. This is a newsletter released by ISA Southeast Asia Center, Drumbeat released by ISA Africa Center, and the Petri Dish by Malaysia Biotechnology Information Center. So with that, I would like to thank you once again. And let's continue to be educated on biotechnology. We have been educated very well on genetic engineering, and still we're having problems on acceptance. Now we have this new technology, the genome editing. Harmonization is needed so that everyone, all of the countries needing new technologies will get the benefits. And ISA is here to help you out in all of the new technologies, and we are extending our service, our information drive, or our information activities to new sciences. Yesterday we had gene drive. Today we have again new breeding technologies, and we invite you to partner with ISA as we move forward. Thank you so much, and let's have a good day. Let's have a good evening, and see you again next time in another ISA webinar. Thank you so much.
Thank you.